the next thing I know, my gun has fired, and there's a hole in the wall of the bathroom that shares a bathroom wall with our neighbor.
You know, if you guys have been listening to the show for a while, you've heard more than one episode where OC spray got someone out of a bind and prevented them from having to use more force in a personal self-defense encounter. Palm Industries is the OC of choice for active self-protection. We love everything about them. We love the efficacy of their product. We've seen it work. Our actual employees have had to use it in the field against a crazy person, and it worked. They've removed any excuse not to carry OC. This is going to solve far more problems more frequently than a firearm, and I wouldn't leave the house without it. As I've said before, I got one for my wife. I got one for my daughter. My son is about to go into law enforcement, carries one. And I've had a good friend, Soleil Rocher, who's a member of the active self-protection team, who used it successfully in a real-life defensive encounter. Get one at get-asp.com/POM. Get-asp.com/POM. Alrighty, gang, welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. Once again, I am your host, Mike Williver, and I remain your favorite former Fed. With us today, a new friend of mine. You're asking, Mike, you have a lot of new friends. Yes, I do. I consider every one of my guests to be a friend once we've gotten to know each other on the show. My new friend's name is Eric. He is married with no children. He is a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, Army National Guard. He was active duty for 9 years and guard for almost 8. And he is just back, fresh back from a 9-month deployment in the Middle East. Eric, how are you, sir?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Again, this is a great lesson. I know that already. I haven't heard the whole story. He emailed me and gave me some of the important details, and I already know it's a good lesson. It's one of those things. It's a little embarrassing and can cause you some real problems. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Eric, you're talking to me from Texas right now. Is that correct?
That's right.
And
Just got back.
Where's home?
Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, to be specific.
Nice. Yeah. My wife and I are big fans. We have good friends up in the northern part of Alabama, up by Florence. Beautiful country, beautiful people, friendliest people you'll ever find in the world. So before it's lovely. Don't tell anyone. It's kind of like Arizona. We're full. We don't need any more people. Thank you. Find another place. Any rate, so you spend a lot of time in the military. First, let me say on behalf of myself and my audience, thank you for your service, and I truly do mean that. I was around when Vietnam vets were still getting scorned and ridiculed and marginalized, and I never ever want to see it go back to what it was back during those days. So, thank you for your service. You signed up to do a job, and it sounds like you're doing it very well. With that said, what is your background prior to the military? Were you ever security, law enforcement, anything like that? And then did you grow up around firearms or in a firearm culture, or not so much?
I grew up around firearms, not so much personal protection. If my dad had a handgun, I didn't know it. We had shotguns and rifles, did a little bit of hunting when I was a teen. When I graduated high school, went straight to college into ROTC, bought my first handgun. I guess I bought my first rifle when I was 19, bought my first handgun when I was 21, a Glock 23, 40 cal. Grew to resent that gun.
Yeah.
I don't know why everyone wants to go the best of both worlds and try to go in between the 9 and the 45, but that was my mindset.
It was popular for a long time. My first several guns with the feds were all 40 cals.
Right. So I finished up ROTC and commissioned into the active duty, and so not really any much of a history there. I was still pretty young and fresh as a brand new lieutenant. Went to flight school. I started out as an Army aviator. Flew the OH-58 Kiowa as a air cav scout.
Nice.
Did that for a little while in Hawaii, and then shifted out of that into electronic warfare for a little while. Ended up shifting over into the Guard and became what they call a simulations officer. So I run exercises now. I call myself like a D&D dungeon master for the Army. I sit behind the white curtain and help people train. So just got back from a deployment. Ended up going into the unit that we deployed to replace did not bring their simulations guy. And so when they needed somebody to go do a one-off job in Saudi Arabia, I ended up being that guy. It was a very interesting job, but I'm very much glad to be back.
Yeah, that sounds like actually sounds like a cool job. I like to say I've lived 1,000 lifetimes of all the stuff I've done through my career in places that people like you and me get to go and see that most people never do. So That
Hmm.
sounds like a ton of fun. So let's get to your the incident in hand. You gave me kind of a
Sure.
rough overview in the email, and we didn't have a big discussion beforehand because, as you know, I like to learn the story and hear the details for the first time along with my audience, so I can give them at least a genuine reaction to
Yeah.
what I'm being told. So, why don't you walk us through the initial day in question, what happened, and what was the aftermath like?
Sure. So I was a first lieutenant stationed in Hawaii with my wife. We lived in a duplex townhome. So, like one side of our house was butted up against the side of another house. And I was at work. It was like a Wednesday afternoon, and um, my wife called and said, "You need to come home. I think there's someone in the house." And my first reaction was, "We live on post. That kind of thing doesn't happen here.
Right,
What are you talking about?"
right.
And she was just insistent that I come home. And I told her, if you're that sure that there's someone in the house, you need to get out of the house and call 911. And she said that she would be embarrassed if they had a whole cavalry come out and check, and there was no one there, and she just needed me to come home. And so I decided that I would do that. And so I come home, and she's sitting on the bottom steps of our staircase with my gun, that stupid 40 cal.
Uh huh.
um, and I took it from her because I'm safer than she is with my gun. Foreshadowing.
Yes.
So we're standing there, and I'm trying to assess the situation. Still of the mindset that there's no way that there's someone in my house. But if there is, then why are we in my house?
Right.
And kind of like the first lesson there, outsource your violence, is
Hmm.
as John usually says. Um, so the cats were acting weird. Um, Kind of made me feel like maybe there is possibly something weird going on here. I was still, having work to do and wanted to get back to the office, and just kind of having a negotiation with the wife. And she decided that if I checked the house and everything was cool, then I could leave, and we would just move on with our day. And so her and I just kind of walked through the house, looking around, looking under tables, behind couches, walking through the bedrooms upstairs. Um, and when I got to the last door of the house upstairs, which was the master bathroom, um, I don't exactly remember what happened in the moment. As surprises go, you probably don't really ever remember what happened in the moment leading up to being surprised. But the next thing I know, my gun has fired, and there's a hole in the wall of the bathroom that shares a bathroom wall with our neighbor.
Okay, so let's be super clear because I know the audience is screaming at me. Um, was the gun in your hand when this happened?
It
Stuff like
was.
that. So yeah, 'cause
Yes.
I just want to be clear. I
Yes.
crave clarity in all things. So
Yes. And to be clear, my booger hook was on the boom
I
switch.
gotcha. So so I guess the question is in this moment before the surprise happened, before the we call them negligent discharges now because you have to violate
Yep.
more than one of the rules of firearm safety to have one. But we already know
Yep.
that. I'm not trying to beat you down. I'm sure you've been beaten out enough already.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
and we'll get to that. Um, in your mind, what sort of mode were you in? Were you seriously thinking there was someone potentially behind a door, or were you just sort of doing this to placate your wife so she wouldn't be so concerned about the state of the house?
I was in the mindset of placating the wife. I do remember thinking, this is the last door we haven't opened yet. If there is someone in our house, they're in here.
Right.
Um, that that thought crossed my mind. I remember that, and then I just opened the bathroom door, and obviously the door was open all the way since I didn't hit it. But and you're right about violating rules of stupid. Luckily, I wasn't pointing my gun at anyone that I wasn't willing to shoot, and that's what really saved the day there.
So
So
after the discharge goes off, I just want to capture the first things that go through your head because I know what it would be for me.
yeah,
But
so
what's the first few thoughts you had right after this happens?
the first thing that went through my head on bang was, look at my wife, look at me. Okay, no one's bleeding. Now I'm like, where did that round go?
Sure.
Um, there was a hole in the wall, obviously there, And my next thought was, the neighbor. Where is the neighbor? Our next door neighbor was a soldier who had a stay-at-home wife, stay-at-home mom. They had a child, and I know they had a dog. And so my immediate thought was, what was on the other side of that wall?
Terrifying, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying. I was panicking. So I put the gun down on the dresser, and the wife and I ran downstairs over to the next door neighbor's house, and I'm pounding on the door, and she had her phone number. So my wife was calling the woman that lives there. And so she answered the phone, and she was out, thank goodness, out to lunch with a friend of hers, and her child was with her. So we knew that, at that point, the worst that could have happened is I hit their dog, but I was still very much worried about that.
Right.
And so the neighbor, she comes home. They were at a restaurant on post, so they got there pretty quick. She comes home and opens up the door, goes in. The dog's fine. My wife, while we were waiting for her to get home, was like, it's still possible that someone could be in there and you left your gun on the dresser. And I was like, okay, fine. So I ran back into the house. And the weird part about this, the part that I never really brought up to the police, because after the interaction that we had, I didn't want to really involve with them anymore. But, when you walk in the front door of that house, you can see the back door of the house. And I had come in through the front door, and we had gone out the front door, but the back door was wide open. And I was like, oh, wow. So, take that for whatever evidence you assess. We never really drove down that rabbit hole of trying to figure out if and where, just because the after action on this was so overwhelming.
Right.
So I run upstairs, grab the firearm, throw it in my pocket, go back around to the neighbor's house, and my wife and the neighbor are upstairs in their master bathroom. So I go up there, and we're just standing there looking at this bulge in their wall. My 40 cal hollow point had expanded enough to stop in their drywall. It didn't hit a stud. It just stopped in the drywall. So, the old adage of, we carry hollow points because they stop in people. We carry hollow points because they stop in walls is valid. I mean, it went through one drywall and stopped in the second.
Wow.
So I thought that was pretty impressive. So we're standing there looking at this damage, and I'm, starting to calm down and get my wits about me, and talking to my wife and my neighbor about what we're going to do about this. My first inclination is, I have to report this. I live on base housing. There's damage to the building. If I don't report it and it gets found out later, that is like immediate guilt, and the ramifications are vast for people who try to hide stuff.
Yeah, it's far worse. I would always tell the new guys, and I was told this, by the way, by an older agent when I started with the feds, and even with the PD. It's rarely the thing that you mess up that gets you in trouble. It's how you react to it. It's the response. It's covering it up or not reporting it or whatever. That's generally what'll get you in trouble. And even if the thing that you did turns out to not have been that serious, I don't know about the military, but civilian federal law enforcement, you could be fired for what's called lack of candor, basically just not telling the whole story or not being upfront with investigators. Even if the initial thing, it's an integrity thing. Even if the initial violation turns out to have been not a big deal, if you're trying to cover stuff up, that could still get you hemmed up. I'm sure that's probably the same way with the military.
Yeah, and that was my thought process at the time. Some people do stupid stuff sometimes. So we're standing there, and it actually became kind of an argument where, my neighbor and my wife both were like, we don't have to tell anybody about this. We'll just do the repair ourselves. It's going to be an easy repair, spackle on one side, push this in on the other, paint it, and we're done. And I was on the side of, no, we need to let them know this is not our house. Right. And so what we did not realize was the neighbor had called the friend that she was out to lunch with and told her what happened. And that friend called the military police.
Oh, that's a friend. Post. All right. That's I believe that's
Oh
known
yeah.
as in military circles as the Blue Falcon. Am I correct?
Yes, yes, indeed, indeed.
How helpful.
Uh, so, um, I finally convinced them that we were going to report this. I told them it's my call, and that's what we're going to do. And so, I was walking back down her stairs to go back to my house, and I literally, like, the timing was perfect. I opened up the door to leave her house, and there was an MP on the other side of it with his hand in the air about to knock,
Hmm.
and startled him a little bit. He startled me. Um, and there was just like a quick questioning of, was there a shot fired here? Yes, there was. Where's the firearm? In my pocket. Don't touch it. Not going to touch it. Um, he reached into my pocket and withdrew it and took it over to his vehicle, unloaded it and set it in his passenger seat, and came back over and was asking me what happened. And I just basically told him, like, I had a negligent discharge. That's the long and the short of it.
Right.
He's like, okay, well, come over here and stand by my vehicle. He separated me from my wife and started asking her questions. Later on, she told me that he was asking her if there was any domestic problems or if we had been in a fight, and whether or not I was the one that fired the gun or she was the one that fired the gun.
Yeah, he kind of has to ask
And
those questions, by the way. So I wouldn't take that too
yeah,
personally.
I don't hold it against him at all.
So
So
before we continue, I got a couple of questions.
sure.
Two things occurred to me. One, the military police officer who arrived initially to investigate, I assume, is probably an enlisted member of the Army.
Yes, he was an E3, a private first class.
So there's a power dynamic there for sure. Even I'm not saying you would be like I'm a lieutenant colonel and you're not. That's not what I mean at all. But it has to be a little bit awkward for him at this moment to be sort of at least initially investigating someone as high ranking as you. That's just an observation, I guess.
Well, remember, I was a lieutenant at the time, not a lieutenant colonel.
Okay.
This was 16 or 14 years ago.
Okay, I got you. But still, officer enlisted. I mean,
Right.
my father was it's very pronounced in the Navy for whatever reason, the difference between officers and enlisted. But it's
Yeah.
a thing. It's a thing that maybe a lot of the listeners might not have thought about or hadn't occurred to them. The second
Yeah.
thing is
So
this. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. So yeah, the power dynamic. So I'm sure that the MPs go through a lot of training to try to defeat that, and do their job regardless of who they're talking with. I know that when I joined, and I just learned that MPs are acting with the authority of the provost marshal,
Mm-hmm.
and that they are police officers, and their rank doesn't matter. You treat them like a police officer.
Right.
So that's what I was doing.
So the second question is, well, that was first one was more of an observation. This is a question, I promise you.
Okay.
And you don't have to answer any more questions about your attorney present, Eric. I'm just letting you know. No, the question is this. In a military setting, you're not, if you're an active duty member on a military base, you don't have the same rights as a private citizen wandering the streets of the
Correct.
town right next to you. So can
Yep.
you tell our audience, if you know, you may not know, I don't know. So I guess what I want to know is if you're approached for a legal reason by a military police officer and he starts asking questions or she starts asking questions, do you have under the military, under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, do you have the same sort of Miranda rights in that position as you would if you were not on a military base and you were not an active duty member? So, for example, if he starts asking you questions, it could be incriminating because the initial questions, and I don't think he'd Mirandized you, were, hey, did you fire a gun? What happened or whatever. And so in a private setting, in a non-military setting, if you're being detained and being asked questions that are incriminating, you have to have your rights read to you. Is that true of in a military setting, or is it completely different?
It is. There's an entire article in the UCMJ called Article 31 that kind of follows the same path of Miranda with different verbiage. Basically tells you don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to say anything. Anything you say is going to be used against you in a criminal trial. And then talks about a right to a lawyer, either a civilian lawyer that you pay for or a military lawyer that's provided for you at no cost. And that is a thing. I think they probably fall under the same rules as the police as far as the questions you have to ask to make sure that the scene is secure versus the questions that you're going to ask in
Right.
order to incriminate somebody,
Right.
and they draw that line around that same place.
So at this point, you'd not been read any rights or been advised that you're being detained or anything like that. We're just getting started.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't even no you're not free to go. None of that has even happened yet.
Did you mention, hey, I was actually literally on my way downstairs to call you guys to report this?
No. In fact, I wasn't going to report it to the police. I was going to report it to housing and just let them know that it happened, and whatever their response to that would be up to them.
Right.
Okay, so I'm standing there, and he's asking her all these questions, and another officer shows up. I think he was an E4, a specialist, showed up. Um, and then they went into my house and kind of looked around, and I guess they looked at the damage. And I mean, it was like so lackadaisical. Like they didn't even leave an officer with me. They both went into the house to go take a look at it. My firearm was sitting in the passenger seat of their car, and I was just standing by their car, just waiting for them to come back. There was like no no concern for that at all.
Which is a good sign. They don't think you're a threat, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So they come back and they're discussing within earshot of me, like, okay, so did this guy commit a crime? I don't know. Has anyone been able to get a hold of Sergeant so and so?
Hey, I got news for you, Eric. That conversation happens, especially with newer officers and agents, all the time. Like you got to break out. You got to break out a rule book and go, okay, so is this technically illegal? John and I did a video that I'm not sure if it's come out yet or not, but it will by the time this comes out. So it's come out, where officers pull up behind people parked in a handicap spot, and that's the reason for their contact. Yeah. And then it turns into a whole thing, and there's a shot fired, guy gets shot. And my contention was, I'm not sure that a parking violation is reasonably isn't meant to be a detention. Like you can't detain someone based on being parked in a red zone. You can write them a ticket, but the detention was weird. So yeah, you want to make sure you're on good legal footing. So I'm not surprised that conversation happened. So what did they end up saying?
So they continued having that conversation within earshot of me, and they couldn't get a hold of their sergeant. They couldn't get a hold of their lieutenant. They decided that they didn't want to call their captain. I guess they didn't want to bother him. And so they're just kind of like hemming and hawing. I mean, we were there for like almost an hour while they were trying to call these people and try to get some guidance and try to understand more about what happened. But all they ever did was ask me questions that I had already answered. And, and they were just, sitting there. And at one point, the specialist was like, "Sir, will you be willing to accompany us to the provost marshal office and just like hang out with us until we can find someone to determine whether or not we need to continue any further with you today?" And I was like, "You know what? Sure." So, I hopped in the back of their car, no cuffs, no you're being detained, and none of that stuff. They just asked me if I would go to the provost marshal's office and wait. And so I did. And so they drove me over there, and they brought me in to the little room with the handcuffs on the bench,
Right.
And I just sat there for like 2 hours waiting for them to find somebody who could let them know whether they were going to let me go back to my life or not. And so eventually someone came in and they were like, "Hey, we're going to do a gunshot analysis and confirm that you're the one that fired that gun." And I was like, "Okay, what does that involve?" And so they're like, "We need to take your uniform jacket because we're going to test it for residue." And I said, "Actually, I wasn't wearing my jacket when I fired. I had taken it off when I got home." And so then I got into this awkward situation where they took my shirt and I put my jacket back on, and I spent the rest of the day wearing my uncomfortable outer uniform jacket with no shirt on,
looking fully like one of the village people.
Right. And so they also did the little like the liquid that they put on the thumb finger webbing on my hand, and it turned black and showed that I had gunpowder residue on my hand. And so then they stuck me back in that little room for probably another hour. And so then they pulled me out of there and they put me in an interrogation room. And I mean, there was no communication at all. Just, "Sir, will you come with me?" Sat me in the room, and sat there for probably another 45 minutes. And I even had my phone the whole time. It was super lax. So the CID agent comes in. So in the criminal investigation in the Army and any other services, I'm sure, CID agents are also mostly enlisted. They're usually E4s, E5s, E6s. They wear civilian clothes. They go by their first name. You would not know that they're, a member of the military investigations at all.
Right. So for the
Um,
audience who may not know, could you tell them what CID stands for?
it's a criminal investigation directorate, I think, or division. I'm not sure what the
I
D
thought it was
is.
division. I know it's so for those who don't know and didn't hear my previous podcast with another military member, every branch, not every branch, uh, the Army has a CID, the Air Force has the Office of Special Investigations, which is the same thing basically, and then there's NCIS for the Navy and the Marine Corps. So every branch has an investigation division in their job. They're basically the detectives for any sort of crime or legal matter that happens on a military base. So he comes in, young guy.
Young guy, about my age actually at the time, came in, introduced himself. I'm, first name so and so, special agent, CID. I have a few questions to ask you, but before we do that, and he slides me across this form, uh, a uh, a rights warning waiver
Mm-hmm.
that has the Article 31 rights written on it, and you basically, if you're going to ask questions, you check I waive my rights and sign it, and if you're not, you check I'm not waiving my rights and sign it. And it's funny because the form has some blocks that they're supposed to fill out, and there's a part where it says what you're suspected or slash accused of doing, and they're supposed to like put a little blurb in there about
Mm-hmm.
what crime you've been suspected of, and it was blank. And and he just like slid it over, and he read it out loud, told me, like, you have the right, you do not have to answer any questions or say anything. uh, anything you say will be used as evidence against you in a criminal trial. You have the right to a private lawyer during or after questioning, and to have that lawyer present with you, and it can be a civilian lawyer if you arrange it, or a military lawyer at no expense. I'm reading this, by the way.
Go
I've
ahead.
got it pulled up here.
That's fine.
um, and so, he slides it across the table, and I said, "This form's not complete. I'm not signing it." And he said, "What?" And I pointed to the part where there was nothing in the suspected accused block, and he said, "Yeah, we're still figuring that part out."
Well, then why
And
am
I
I being
said,
questioned? Would be my next question.
"Yeah,
And the
right."
next word out of
And
my
I,
mouth would be lawyer, but go ahead. I'm assuming you didn't say
yeah,
that.
so the next word out of my mouth was, "I invoke my right to silence."
Okay,
And
good.
he actually like dropped his jaw, like surprised that I said that. And he goes, "You're not going to talk to me?" And I just shook my head, and I did not say another word. He sat there and stared at me for a good 40 seconds, I guess, trying to make an awkward pause and hope that I filled the silence, but I just sat there. And so he got up and said, "I'll be back," and he left. And I was sitting there for another probably an hour and a half. So I mean, by this point, it's like probably around 8, 9 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
And he comes in and he says, "We're releasing you to the recognizance of your commander." And
Oh
I was
boy.
like, "My commander's here?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Okay." So I walk out expecting, the captain that was in charge of my troop. And I walk out, and it's the lieutenant colonel in charge of my squadron.
Oh boy.
And he was leaving to go to Iraq for a few weeks the next morning. And I had stomped on his last evening with his family before he left.
That is, as my father would say, who was a military officer, that is suboptimal. That is not what you
Yes,
want.
it was not great. So um, the ride back to the house was less than pleasant. He basically like was like, "What were you thinking?" And I was like, "Wasn't, sir." You know what? You get
Yeah.
into this mode where you don't argue. You just take it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't thinking, sir. Sorry to step on your evening. And he's like, "Yeah, we're gonna do something about this." And took me home. And so I guess I can I can go down the response after this was there was nothing from the military justice, CID, nothing. Um, they they didn't contact me again. They didn't give me a police report until I requested one.
Well,
Um,
in their defense,
they're
if you've invoked your right to silence and or an attorney, they can't contact you,
Oh, that's a good point.
unless it's to arrest you. So they were doing their job there, as it turns out.
Yeah. So, there was never any arrest. So, the next morning, the military throws the book and basically says, "Hey, we're gonna move you out of this unit. You're gonna go to a new unit. Um, we're gonna give you a GOMAR. It's a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand. That's basically a career ender. That letter basically says, "Hey, you did this. That was wrong of you. Um, I'm reprimanding you formally. It goes into your record if they file it permanently. It's the first thing the promotion board sees when
Mm.
it's time to get promoted next, and you don't get promoted. And the way
I
the
mean,
military works, if
period. That
if
just
you
you're
stay
definitely
one,
not getting promoted at that point once that letter's
oh
in your
yeah,
file. Okay,
yeah,
no
you're done.
exceptions. Okay.
The way the military works is once you hit X years at a given rank and you have not promoted to the next rank, you're out. So that's there's a lot of limitations on what the military can do to officers administratively, mostly because the laws are written by officers.
Yeah, imagine that.
So they there's very few opportunities for them to just go, you messed up, you're out. So the general response when someone has a big mess up is to give them a GOMAR and just wait, and then they just get weeded out by not getting promoted.
I've seen Top Gun Maverick, so I know all about how this works.
Mm-hmm. The most realistic military movie in the world, right?
100%. Yeah. Just take $1 billion aircraft and do whatever you want with it. I mean, and there's no you just get yelled at. And that's it.
That's all.
Yeah. So during this period between, first of all, how long was it between the incident and them saying we're going to give you this? They're going to put this memo in your file, and what are you actively concerned during that time, or are you just like, I guess we're done, or what were you thinking?
I was freaking out. I was wanting to continue my career, concerned that I wouldn't be able to. I was just about to get promoted to captain, and I thought maybe that wouldn't even happen. Um, you know, the concern was real, and there is a process that it goes through. They don't just do this in a vacuum and you just find it in your record there, and I'll go through that in a sec. But it was literally the next morning because he was flying that day, and so called me to the carpet at 7:30 in the morning the very next day to tell me what his plan was, and about a week later, I was showing up to my new unit and no longer in that squadron. Um, the the way the GOMAR works is your unit provides raw data up to the brigade commander. The brigade commander uses that to write a recommendation for a GOMAR to the general officer that's in charge of the overall unit that they're part of, and that general then uses their discretion to write the letter. And what they usually do is they don't decide whether to file it permanently or locally until they get a response back from the person who has received the letter.
So permanently
And
versus locally, meaning it'll be in your jacket forever, or they're going to file it somehow like at the base where it won't follow you if you transfer. Is that what that means?
that's exactly right. So if they
Okay.
file it locally, that saves your bacon. No one will ever see it. So your career is allowed to continue to progress.
Okay.
So that's like a shot across the bow. Like you got a good warning.
Right.
So it was probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks later when I finally got the letter from the general, and the letter was wild. It was, Lieutenant so and so, you have been accused of a possible domestic violence issue
What?
with your wife. You illegally concealed carried a pistol on the army post. You discharged a weapon without reporting it. Yeah, there was a whole bunch of stuff on there that was just like, what is this?
So what? Where are they getting this DV angle from? Just because that's what the patrolman may have thought might have happened, or I mean, obviously your wife didn't go say anything to that effect.
No, she didn't. And I don't know how that happened. I mean, it could be as simple as my squadron commander was just BSing with one of the guys in the provost marshal office, and they mentioned that their initial, questioning included that, and it just sparked in his mind. I don't know how that got in there.
I'm sorry. Two questions. One: are you allowed to have private firearms in your quarters in your residence on a base? Because I don't know.
Yes, you are. You are only allowed to transport it if it's unloaded in your trunk, and you have to be going to or from somewhere where you're using it, like a gun range.
Okay.
You have to register it with the provost marshal by serial number and make and model when you arrive at the installation. And then you have to, if you sell it, you have to unregister it to let them know it's gone. It's very restrictive.
But in your case,
We lose a lot of our civil rights to protect everyone else's.
yeah, you sure do. So, but all that had been done as far as in your case, you followed all
Yes,
those steps. And I had
yes,
another
and
question, and I'm old, and it's escaped my mind.
sure.
You were
Oh, okay.
you were gonna say, yeah, I forgot my question. I'm sorry.
No worries. Um, the and I had also gotten all of my magazines pinned to only allow 10 rounds since it was Hawaii. They have some interesting laws over there.
Yeah, we have a friend in Hawaii, a couple friends in Hawaii that are doing the Lord's work, trying to get some of that reverse. It's slow going, but they're making progress. Just for the record, here is my other
Yeah.
question. Actually, more of an observation.
Hmm.
It seems to me that a general, if people don't know, the rank of general is the highest rank. There's various ranks within the rank of general, but it's as high as you go without being a joint chief of staff or the president. So
Right.
a general is overseeing a lot of things, and the plethora of things that go on any military base. It's a lot of moving parts. So a general by design has a 30,000-foot view of what goes on at the base. He's not down in the minutia. Generally speaking, that's what he has subordinates for. I
Yep.
would imagine that he's writing this letter based on whatever he heard, and I'm sure he didn't launch his own investigation into it. So does that
No.
make sense?
And that's the beautiful part about GOMARs is, and I say that facetiously because there is no burden of proof at all for a
Wow.
GOMAR. Your brigade commander writes it, literally drafts it, and sends it to the general. The general's staff in the executive office there checks it for spelling errors, and then the general signs it, and
Wow.
that's it.
Wow. Yeah, I had no idea. I'd never heard of a Gomar before today.
Yeah, it's a helpful tool when people are actually doing things that require them to not be in the military anymore.
Right.
But in my case, it was pretty crazy. So I, in response to that, I think I had 15 days to respond with a written answer to the allegations essentially, and it said in the GOMAR, your response will dictate whether this gets filed locally or permanently, and had some outlines of like what happens to people who get a permanently filed GOMAR.
So are they trying to induce you to be like, yeah, I did all these things? Is that what you read into that or no?
Generally speaking, and I do know some people who have gotten GOMARs before, and I've been pretty open telling my story to friends of mine as I've gone, and people have opened up about GOMARs that they've gotten in the past. Generally speaking, the mindset is, fall on your sword, admit to everything, tell them that you're learning from your mistake, and if you're allowed to continue your service, this will never happen again.
Which
And
would
then,
which would be almost acceptable. I mean, just to
right,
get your butt out of the fire, except for the domestic
yeah,
violence in languages.
right,
That's no good.
yeah, and so that usually is the trigger for the general to go, oh, okay, and file it locally. But I mean, I have to imagine in a world where we have so many issues with domestic violence in the military, that if I had said, yeah, sure, go with that, then they still would have filed it permanently.
Mm,
So, and I mean, spoiler alert, I'm still in the military this many years later. It was not filed permanently. I've
right.
been promoted 3 times since then. Um, So I called up the provost marshal and said, "Hey, I need that police report." And so they sent it, and it was pretty involved. They actually took photos in every single room of my house, and I didn't know that until I got the police report from them. Um, but there was a little block on the police report that said probable cause for uh, continued something. I forget what it was, but I don't have it in front of me. Basically, they said there is no probable cause for anything. No crimes were committed. No further investigation required. This is a non-issue.
Right.
Um, there was no mention in the police report of domestic violence at all. Um, so I wrote back to the general and attached the report and basically, just told him what I told you. I was stupid. I made a stupid mistake. I had a negligent discharge. I was planning on reporting it, didn't get a chance because the police got there too soon. All that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, at that point, the unit that I was in, I had to go to a school in the mainland in order to learn how to do my new job. And I was at that school, and I got a phone call, answered it, and it was the judge advocate general for the base. So that was a colonel, like the head lawyer for the general staff. And he called me and said, "Hey, I need you to talk to the general." And I said, "Okay." And so I got put on hold, and the general was like, "Listen, I need to give you an apology. I'm going to write you a formal apology. You'll get that in the mail soon. But I'm rescinding this GOMAR. It should have never even been brought to my attention. You shouldn't have gotten a GOMAR at all. I'm not filing this permanently. I'm not filing this locally. I'm rescinding it."
Can I just say,
And
Eric, you have provided the Active Self-Protection podcast audience with his first ever plot twist, because I did not see that coming.
no one did.
No, indeed.
So I was, flabbergasted. I did not expect that to happen. And then he said, "Further, I want you in my office tomorrow. I'm going to bring in your squadron commander and your brigade commander, and basically they're going to tell you as well that this should have never gone to the extent that it went. People have accidents. If the MPs had not been called, then nobody would ever have known about this, and they didn't need to know about this." And I was just shocked.
I love
And
everything
so,
about that response, but I got to say, in that moment when you're on the phone with the general, you're saying you're talking to him person to person. Okay.
yes,
In that moment, what's going through your head? You got to feel a ton of relief.
absolutely, just a ton of relief. And so I told him I can't come to your office tomorrow because I'm in another state. And he said, "Okay, don't worry about it." And so the next day, I got a call from my brigade commander apologizing. And then I got a call from my squadron commander apologizing. And at that point, it was time to get promoted to captain. And he actually said, "You know what? I need to do a show to the unit and let them know that this is behind us, and this isn't going to be a huge impact. So I know you're not in my unit anymore, but you and all the other lieutenants that are in this unit are getting promoted on the same month. And so we're going to do a mass ceremony, and I want you to come back and get promoted with your buddies." And so that was huge. So I came back, and the rumor mill had been going real hard, and lots of people saying lots of things about what happened and what didn't happen.
Oh yeah.
But it was very helpful to kind of quash that when I showed up for the promotion ceremony, and they saw that I wasn't flagged in the system, that I was going to be allowed to get promoted, that I'd been personally invited to come back and promote with them by the squadron commander, and just basically that this thing was behind us. And that job that I ended up getting, because I basically got fired from my job, was the best assignment that I've had in my career. And the schools that they sent me allowed me to get more skills that directly led to the civilian job that I have as a federal employee now, as well as, getting put into more and more positions of higher responsibility that have made it to the point where I actually got promoted to lieutenant colonel about 18 months earlier than I otherwise would have. And
Nice.
so, yeah, that was a benefit. So, yeah, my my grandpa has this saying. He says, "You fell, you came up smelling like roses," and I definitely I definitely did.
Wow, that is some story. We've gotten some sad endings recently to some of our stories. Things didn't work out so well for a defender, or in your case, a potential defender. But I love a happy ending. We got to go in a few minutes here. I want to talk lessons though before we part ways. First of
Yeah,
all, as
yeah,
always,
definitely.
thank you for writing in and being willing to tell your story. If it weren't for you, there are people like you. There wouldn't be a show. There'd be no one for me to talk to. No one wants to hear me talk to myself for an hour. And I want to thank you, the listener who's listening to this, for tuning in. The numbers are getting better and better, and more people are tuning in. And hopefully, if the indication from the feedback I'm getting tells me anything, it's that people are learning lessons and they're getting mental reps and they're getting to think through things that maybe they hadn't thought through before. So lessons in yours. One of the most important things I think I want to talk about, and I think you know this already, but let's talk about it anyway, is mindset. You're clearing this house kind of half-heartedly, not really thinking there was someone there. Turns out there might have been someone there. We still don't know.
Still
But
don't know.
the point I want to make is if you're going to do something like clear your own home, which I don't recommend if you don't have to, if you can get out of the house and like Eric said, outsource surveillance, have the police come in and have a look for you. They're trained. They have body armor. They have long guns. They have shields and all that stuff. So if you really honestly believe there's someone in your house, I recommend calling the police. If you want to do it yourself, hey, it's a free country, depending on what country you're listening to this in, and do what you need to do. But it can end up going poorly, which in this case it did in a different way. So if you're clearing a house, clear the house, and approach it from the mentality that, yeah, there is someone in my house, and I'm going to find that person, and that person might be armed. The second thing I want to talk about is you got to practice safety until you can't get it wrong. With that said, I know tons of cops and federal agents and private citizens who've had negligent discharges, and there wasn't any malice. They weren't even really being stupid or doing something stupid. It's just a thing that still happens, but we still have to strive for perfection when it comes to handgun handling or any firearm handling. And then the last thing I want to talk about with you, Eric, is, do you feel like being cooperative and going down, never mind you invoking your right to silence, which I agree with, initially answering their questions and then going down to the station and waiting around, not being told you were being detained. You could have gotten up and left at any time. Do you feel like that was the route to go? And what would you recommend someone else in your specific situation with a military detention like this? What would you recommend someone else do?
Yeah, so I will touch on the whole firearm safety thing. Nobody's more safe with a firearm than someone who's had an ND. At this point,
Right.
I have my finger so high in register that I'm like feeling strain on the webbing between my first and second finger. I
Right.
am nowhere near that trigger.
If tip of your fingers touching the other side of the gun.
Yeah, exactly. Wrapping it around the top.
Yeah.
So I will say, I do think that if I had started going the cross route of saying, no, I don't want to come with you, you guys can figure out what you need to do, it probably would have escalated, and they may have actually just said, okay, well, you're detained.
Right.
And that would have colored the situation a little bit differently. I think that it probably was okay to be as cooperative as possible, but have that hard line where when it switches from we don't know what we're going to do to, all right, well, we want you to go ahead and tell us everything that happened today, that's when you realize that they're not on your side and you need to act appropriately.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry
absolutely.
to interrupt you. Yeah, especially post Miranda. Folks, if you're Mirandized for any reason, what that means is you're not free to go, and they're going to ask you incriminating questions. Just know that. If those two things weren't in place, there's no reason to read Miranda, or in your case, this military version of Miranda. So if Miranda's been read to you, that means most likely they suspect you've committed a crime, and they are now going to ask you potentially incriminating questions. So as much pressure as you might feel, as much as you might want to be cooperative and help, and you like cops, you're pro law enforcement, whatever. In that moment, you have to ask yourself, do I really want to talk about this right now? Am I in the right frame of mind? Because what can happen is between the immediate aftermath of a critical incident, whatever it might be, whether it's an ND or it's, you had to use a defensive weapon in some way and there's an injury or there's a death. In the aftermath of that, you're not in the same mental state as you're going to be in 6 months. So if you give a statement right away, that statement is going to be carved in stone, right? And any deviation from that statement later on, anything that you and your lawyer talk about, and you're like, oh, you know what? Actually, this is actually what happened. That's all out the window. Now they're going to claim, well, he's changing his story. She's changing her story. Because the night of, when it was fresh in his or her mind, this is what he or she said. And so you can't get hemmed up by something you don't tell the cops. Now, I was a cop for many years, and no one should respect the Constitution more than, in my opinion, than the military and the law enforcement. They're the people that we entrust with, all these weapons and all this authority and power. And those people, I feel like, should be the most conscientious of what is in the Constitution. You raise your right hand, I raise my right hand, and swore to defend and protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So if you're feeling like, oh, this cop's going to get mad, if I ask for a lawyer, or if I say I'm just not comfortable talking right now, or whatever you want to put it, put that out of your mind, because when you're facing felony charges over something you said or misspoke, you're not going to care about who's uncomfortable. You know what I mean? So in your case, Eric, I want to commend you for saying, you know what, I'm just not going to talk right now. I think that was a smart move. Is this something you never thought about prior to that day, as far as if something happens, what am I going to say? Or is this something you had to kind of figure out on the fly?
Absolutely not. I had never thought about any of that before. And, I did have that urge to, quickly clear this up. Like, they'll understand. I'll just tell them what happened. But for some reason, I just had that little click in my brain when he slid that paper across. I said, you know what? They're trying to burn me. I'm not going to fall for it. I will say, like, the lesson that I've learned, and as I've thought about this in the years past, you have your opportunity to, tell your side and make, help people understand what actually happened. You don't have to be in a rush. In fact, I think the best way to do it is via writing, because you can sit down, write it down, make sure your wording is right, words have meaning, and make sure that you're saying what you mean to be saying, and then turn it in. You don't have to worry about misspeaking or getting nervous. And, if that process takes a few weeks or a month or years, fine, you have that time.
Yeah, on this side of a jail cell, by the way, to boot.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is always nice. All right, folks. Rocco, the Active Self-Protection Podcast mascot, has now wandered into my studio, and I think he's hungry. So I'm going to have to wrap this up. Eric, thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, don't forget to stick around for the Gutowski Files following this. Always a good time with our friend Stephen Gutowski from thereload.com. And if you're thinking about it and you have a moment, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to this. And leave us a review and tell us what you like, what you don't like. That's the only communication I have with folks who listen to the show. So if you have a suggestion for an improvement or to tell me how wrong I am, which I get told all the time, that's a good place to do it. Eric, thanks again for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Great story.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, folks. Welcome back to this installment. Welcome to this installment of the Gutowski Files featuring Stephen Gutowski. He is the founder of thereload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast. Stephen is literally fresh off a flight from Las Vegas. He was out at SHOT Show. We'll talk about that a little bit here in a second. Stephen,
fresh
how are you?
Fresh is not the right word for it, though.
What's that?
Fresh is not the right word.
Yeah, no.
Coming off a 5-hour flight.
It's pretty much the least fresh you'll ever be is getting off a plane. Yeah, you're right. How are you, sir?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. But yeah, SHOT Show was pretty wild, as it usually is in Las Vegas. There, the industry's trade show. But not a ton of political news. There was some stuff on pistol braces. The ATF director was there, and he didn't really make much news, but it was interesting that he showed up. I didn't get the warmest reception, as you might imagine. But
I hope people were civil, at least.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. These are people who are professionals, and they have to, whether they like what the ATF is doing or not, they have to try and figure out a way to run their business. So they're very interested in what the director has to say about how these various new rules and bans are going to affect their businesses, even if, they're at the same time fighting them in court.
Yeah. for those who can't tell already, I have some sort of allergy cold thing going on, so I'm going to try to talk as little as possible and let Stephen do most of the talking so you're not super annoyed with my voice. Stephen, we are talking this week about that there's been a ban on AR platform, or excuse me, assault rifles, assault weapons, whatever they call them, in Illinois. And there's a feel-good aspect to this, which is that according to the story over at thereload.com written by Jake Fogelman, the headline is dozens of Illinois sheriffs vow to not enforce the new gun ban or registry requirement, which I love. One of the reasons I think that police chiefs should be elected is this exact same sort of thing. You're more likely to follow the will of the people rather than whoever your political boss is. If you're elected, you have to answer to the electorate, to your constituents. So what's going on with this ban, and what's going on with the sheriffs there in Illinois, Stephen?
Yeah, sure. And there's always been that sort of dichotomy that you alluded to there between elected sheriffs and police chiefs that tend to be appointed by, mayors or other politicians. And there's always been sort of a disagreement among law enforcement officials, depending on where they're from and who they represent, just like there are disagreements between the politicians that represent everyone, and for the same reasons. And so this is not the first time, Rick, that we've seen local sheriffs refuse to enforce certain kinds of gun laws that they believe are unconstitutional. In fact, this is very similar to what happened in New York and upstate New York after the SAFE Act passed, which was New York's version of the register all your so-called assault weapons. Obviously, this affects the main target are AR platform firearms, AK style firearms, AK-47, AK-74s, those sorts of things. But these bans also, of course, affect far more than just those guns because of the way that they are constructed, which is essentially if it's a semi-automatic rifle that can accept detachable magazines and it has a certain number of additional features like a flash suppressor or a barrel shroud, or
those things make the guns
grip
more deadly, as I understand. Is that right, Stephen?
That's the argument, certainly, right, that is put forward by advocates for these bans. Now, Illinois' ban is similar in that construction, the way that, most of these bans have gone and the way that the national ban worked, except these days advocates are pushing, and Illinois has adopted a stricter version of it by making, instead of 2 of those features, you can only have 1. So you get the idea. It affects a lot more firearms.
Right.
Any semi-automatic rifle or pistol or shotgun variation, but specifically rifles, if it has even 2 of these features, then it's just no longer legal. Well, no longer legal to sell. You will be legal to keep them, but you'll be required to register them within 300 days, or you could face criminal prosecution. Now, that's where this dispute comes in with local law enforcement, because certainly there's a big question of how you enforce something like that. Illinois is a little different from most states in that it has a firearm owner identification card system, which is sort of like a registry, but instead of for guns, it's for gun owners. So you get a little card that says, once you go through the process, it's basically a background check. You get a card that's valid for so long, and you're allowed to buy guns legally if you have one of those cards. So Illinois knows, in theory, everyone who owns guns in the state, but they don't know what guns they own, and they don't have a record. They don't have a registry of the kinds of firearms they bought. So if you bought an AR-15 in, downstate Illinois, because Chicago has had a ban on these for a while now, but the rest of the state hasn't. And the government doesn't know you have that gun necessarily. And so that's why they want you to register it, because they want to ban all the new sales of them. Now, obviously, this brings up the age-old concern among gun owners that registration leads to confiscation, or at the very least makes confiscation a more practical goal, easier to achieve. You've seen this in other countries recently. New Zealand, for one, had a registry and then decided that people should no longer be allowed to own certain kinds of guns, and use that registry as part of their effort to confiscate those guns. Canada is doing the same thing right now. with regards to AR-15s and similar firearms, and is on its way to banning handgun ownership as well. So really almost a total ban on gun ownership just north of us here. So obviously these concerns are drawn from something very legitimate. And the sheriffs, I think, reflect that concern among their own constituents, that they believe this is something that could lead to confiscation and is something on its face unconstitutional. And of course, there are multiple legal challenges to this law now being filed. It is on shakier legal footing than ever before. All of the assault weapons bans in the United States, because of the Supreme Court ruling that we've talked at length about on the podcast in the past. And I think it's a very good chance that this law will get blocked. It's not as certain when that is going to happen, or even if it's going to happen before that 300-day sort of grace period for registration ends. And so you may well still see a lot of people become criminals if they choose not to register their firearms before this law gets blocked in court. And so this really does become a very practical issue, these sheriffs versus the state government, because the governor, Pritzker, the Democrat, has accused these sheriffs of political grandstanding and said, alluded to the idea that they have to enforce this law, but that, I don't think there's anything he can really do to these guys.
No, there's not. Sheriff's a very independent office, so I know that from working for a long time with the San Diego, California Sheriff's Department. I'm pretty sure sheriff is almost completely autonomous, and there's no he or she has no sort of loyalty to the governor or the state law, other than that's the body of law they enforce, the state law and the vehicle code or whatever. But no, I don't think there's anything a governor can do to a duly appointed sheriff unless they're doing something wildly illegal, that's on its face illegal. I really, just for the record, I really like the statement from James Mendrick, he's the DuPage County Sheriff. He said, "I, among many others, believe that HB 5471 is a clear violation of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution." That's really all the letter had to say, in my opinion. That kind of says it all. Clearly it is. And then he goes on to say that, since he's the head of all the jails, they're not going to house anyone who is arrested solely for that. So, for example, if somebody's arrested for murder and they stack on a charge under this new law, I don't think you're going to make a big deal about it. But someone who's arrested simply for possessing a gun that was legal yesterday, they're not going to enforce that. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's the position they're taking. The governor has said he will use other means of law enforcement. Presumably, he's referencing the state police, which he does have more direct control over. But of course, the problem there is state police only have so many resources.
Right.
And so without local cooperation to enforce a law like this, and especially, like I said earlier, a law where you don't actually know who has these guns, and that's, again, by design. That is what a lot of gun owners want. They don't want there to be a registry. Now, obviously, there are people who do want registries, and they exist. But most gun owners don't want them, and this is the exact reason why. It makes the task of trying to enforce a law like this a lot harder. And if you don't have local cooperation, I think it's basically impossible. You've seen this in practice here in the United States. In New York, as I referenced earlier, they did not register very many of those guns that were supposed to be registered.
Right.
And sheriffs in upstate New York, which is the area where most of those guns were, just like downstate Illinois is going to be the area that's contested here. Most people didn't register them, and the sheriffs didn't try to go around knocking on doors to figure out if you had a gun that you're supposed to register.
Yeah.
And so, to me, the sheriffs are in the stronger position in terms of both the practical fight over whether or not they're going to enforce this law, and in the legal fight over whether or not this law is constitutional. Because, again, the rules have changed since these laws started passing back in the 90s. It's interesting that we're even seeing these happen again, honestly. There's a 20-year lull where you didn't have new assault weapons bans passed at the state level. And now you're seeing, there was one in Delaware last year. which is also being challenged in court, of course. I mean, basically all of them across the entire country are facing a challenge, or in a district that has a case against the assault and ban going, federal district. And so, it's interesting to see this sort of momentum growing in the gun control side of the aisle for these policies again, right as they're on the cusp of perhaps being completely tossed as unconstitutional under the Second Amendment, because that's a very real possibility. The Supreme Court didn't address this directly in Bruin, but it did set up a standard that makes these laws much harder to justify under the Constitution. And it also granted, vacated, and remanded the Maryland assault weapons ban case. And in that case, the district court, or sorry, the appeals court had upheld the ban. And so by vacating that ruling, it doesn't exactly tell you what the Supreme Court thinks, but it gives you some clue that they might not agree with upholding that law.
Correct. I just want to, before I let you go, and I have to go attempt to blow my nose. Wish me luck, people. I want to point out a particularly galling quote from Governor Pritzker. Quote, "This is political grandstanding at its worst," he says, as he politically grandstands. "Sheriffs have a constitutional duty to uphold the laws of the state, not pick and choose which laws they support and when. Anyone who advocates for law, order, and public safety and then refuses to follow the law is in violation of their oath of office," which is hilarious. He brings up the oath of office because in the oath of office for pretty much every law enforcement, military person across the country, to include senators and the president, it says, I swear to uphold, to protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, that's exactly what he's doing. His oath of office says, no, you follow the Constitution. And if someone passes a completely arbitrary, capricious law that makes a perfectly law-abiding person a felon or even a misdemeanant, if that's a word, overnight, you don't enforce it. So my hat's off to them for that. Stephen, I got to let you go. I'm so glad you're home safe and sound from shot, and I will see you next week, my friend.
Absolutely.